In every life there are things we lose, a glove, a photograph, a person we meant to hold on to just a little longer. Most of us move on, pretending those absences don't ache, but some souls cannot. In a quiet flat on Leith Walk, an old man has spent a lifetime keeping what the world forgets. A ribbon, a thimble, a small bear with one missing eye. Each one carries a story, a heartbeat, a memory once cherished. And when a weary social worker steps through his door, what begins as a welfare visit becomes something far deeper, a journey through grief, redemption, and the fragile art of mending what's broken. So settle in and let this story find you, because some things aren't meant to be discarded, they're meant to be found.
This is The Keeper of Lost Things, written by Coops.
Chapter 1. The Catalogue of Loss. The fifth case file of the day landed on Tess's desk with a dull, weary thud. It was the sound of another life in disarray, another fragile existence reduced to paper. She stared at it for a long time before opening it, her fingertips faintly trembling. Burnout wasn't a collapse, she'd learned. It was a slow suffocation, a quiet erosion of empathy under endless paperwork and policy. Appleby, Bernard, address 4th Hack, 17 Leith Walk. Referral, concerned neighbour. Reason, suspected hoarding, welfare check. The words were as clinical as a prescription label. Tess knew the pattern before she'd even left the office. Rooms narrowed into corridors of clutter, forgotten furniture suffocating beneath stacks of newspapers, towers of things clinging to meaning long after their owners had stopped. Hoarding wasn't greed. It was grief turned inside out. She rubbed the back of her neck, staring at the page until the letters blurred. 47 minutes until her shift ended. Still, she packed the file into her bag and pulled on her coat. Someone had to knock on the door. Someone always did. Across the city, Bernard Appleby was already awake to her arrival, though he didn't yet know her name. He had been repairing a tiny porcelain rabbit, its ear broken decades ago. The faint scent of glue mingled with lemon oil and dust, a scent that felt, to him, like time itself. His flat on Leith Walk was an archive of tenderness disguised as chaos. Light poured in through the high bay window, striking 1,000 remembered surfaces, brass keys, faded ribbons, forgotten letters stacked by the window like tiny tombstones of memory. To a stranger it would look like madness. To Bernard, it was order. Each shelf was carefully labelled in his tidy looping hand. Single gloves, winter leather, pens that have ceased to function, buttons of significance. Shattered things, mended. He pressed the porcelain ear into place and exhaled slowly. It wasn't just glue that held things together. It was patience, remembrance, the refusal to let small things die quietly. Then came the doorbell, sharp and electric, a sound that broke his stillness like a hammer striking glass. Bernard winced. Visitors, in his experience, rarely brought good news. Through the frosted pane he saw a woman, young, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled too tightly back and a clipboard hugged to her chest. Her expression was the sort that tried to be kind while rehearsing disappointment. He opened the door an inch. "Yes?" "Mr. Appleby?" "Bernard Appleby," she said, holding up her ID. "I'm Tess Faraday, from Social Services. May I come in?" Her tone was polite but practiced, the gentleness of someone who'd had to deliver bad news far too often. Bernard hesitated, his hand resting on the edge of the door as if guarding something fragile behind it. "I'm quite all right, thank you," he said, voice steady but small. "There's no need. It's just a routine visit, Bernard, to make sure you're comfortable, managing all right." He sighed, the sound like an old clock winding down. Then, with the reluctant courtesy of a man who still believed in manners, he stepped aside. The air changed as Tess entered. She'd been in 100 homes like this, but never one that felt like this. The room breathed, layers of scent and story, old paper, lemon polish, faint tea leaves. Her eyes darted automatically, fire hazards, full risks, health code violations. But beneath the mental checklist, something gentler stirred, the unmistakable sensation of stepping into a memory that wasn't hers. Bernard closed the door behind her and said quietly, "You see a mess, but it isn't." Tess smiled faintly. "I see a lot of objects." "Not objects," he corrected, lifting a small mitten from a nearby shelf. It was sky blue, frayed at the cuff, with a single snowflake embroidered on the back. "This was found on a park bench, the Royal Botanic Gardens, 3 winters ago, frost on the railings. No sign of its twin. It waited all morning, so I brought it home. He replaced it carefully and pointed to another relic, a chipped thimble. Outside a pub on Rose Street, a Saturday night, the ground still slick with rain. Someone had sown something important that night. I could feel it. He turned back to her, eyes the colour of a winter sky. They weren't discarded, Miss Faraday. They were lost. There's a difference. Something in his voice reached past her training and touched the place where empathy still lived. Tess found herself lowering her clipboard, caught between duty and understanding. "Mr. Appleby, I'm concerned for your safety," she said softly. "There's barely room to move, and with this much paper, this much wood," he interrupted gently. "And what of their safety? The things that waited to be found. If I throw them away, their stories end here, in a bin lorry bound for nowhere. You think of hazards, I think of endings." His words hung in the air like the slow toll of a church bell. Tess had no prepared answer. For a long moment she simply stood there, surrounded by the hum of 1,000 clocks and the whisper of lives long vanished. A draught stirred the curtains, scattering dust motes that glimmered like tiny stars. Tess thought suddenly of her own flat, sterile, impersonal, the walls bare except for one cheap print from IKEA. There was nothing of her in it, no story, no trace. Bernard noticed her glance soften. "You collect too, you know," he said. "We all do. Some keep photographs, some keep regrets." Tess blinked, startled by the precision of the comment. "I just try to help people move on." "Ah," Bernard murmured, turning back to the porcelain rabbit. "And who helps you?" The question unsettled her. No one ever asked. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words refused to form. He smiled faintly, as if satisfied that silence said enough. Then, almost ceremoniously, he placed the rabbit on its shelf, where it gleamed in the muted afternoon light. "There," he said, "shattered things, mended." For a moment, Tess could have sworn the air itself shifted, as though time had paused just long enough for two lonely people to understand each other. When she finally left, closing the door softly behind her, the city noise rushed back like a tide. But she carried something with her, the faint scent of lemon polish and old paper, and a phrase she couldn't quite shake. Shattered things mended. Chapter 2. The first story, the blue hair ribbon. The memory of Bernard's flat would not let Tess alone. It rode the bus with her, stood at the foot of her bed, hovered at the edges of her tidy kitchen where the kettle clicked off into careful silence. Her own apartment was spare by design. A sofa, a bookshelf, a table with 2 chairs, the surfaces so clean they reflected light. Everything had a purpose, everything had a place, and nothing told a story. At work, her supervisor skimmed Tess's initial notes and nodded the way experienced people nod when the ending seems obvious. "Classic presentation," Linda said, tapping the file with a pen. "Compassion, but firmness. We need a plan for reducing risk. Decluttering, cleaning, maybe moving him to sheltered accommodation if he cannot maintain basic standards." Tess agreed aloud and disagreed quietly. She took the checklist anyway, a paper shield to hide behind, and walked back to Lath Walk with resolve that felt more like armour than kindness. The frayed doormat was the same, the air at the landing cool and faintly smelling of old stair varnish. Before she could knock, the door opened. Bernard had been waiting. He gave a small nod, not welcome, not refusal, and turned to lead her inside. "I have made tea," he said, not as hospitality but as ritual. 2 delicate cups waited on a small table cleared between 2 armchairs. Around them the room rose like a tide. Shelves and boxes and labelled trays, a cathedral of small rescues. Tess's clipboard felt clumsy in her hands, like a tool for the wrong craft. "Thank you, but there is no need," she began, the practised cadence lining up on her tongue. "Bernard, the council can offer a service that is discreet and supportive. We can—" "It is needed for me," he said gently, lowering himself into his chair. "Tea is polite." The rebuke was tender and effective. Tess sat. She balanced the clipboard on her knee, ready to begin the careful script of safety and risk, and saw Bernard's gaze travel past her to a small frame on the wall. A single ribbon lived there beneath glass, faded blue, tied into a neat bow against a field of black velvet. He did not look at her when he spoke. "It was a market day," he said softly, and the room changed with the words. "The grass market. Noisy, bright stalls, bruised apples, frying doughnuts. voices rising and falling like gulls. Tess felt the clipboard slide from her knee to the floor. Bernard's voice belonged to another room now, another hour. "I was 7, he said. "My sister was 4, Elara. She held my hand. It vanished into mine, so small I could close my fingers and feel the whole of her. She wore a yellow dress with a white collar, and this ribbon, the exact blue of morning. My mother stood at a fabric stall. She touched a bolt of cloth, the way you might stroke a cat, absent and loving. And she said, 'Bernard, hold your sister, do not let go.' His hands, those careful, mending hands, opened on his knees as if showing her the emptiness that followed. I did not let go, not at first, but a man set a small monkey on a bar and it chattered and hopped and the sounds in my head all moved at once. I turned for a heartbeat, and when I turned back, he swallowed, the effort visible. Her hand was gone. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was reverent. I called her name until my throat burned. I ran between legs and baskets and prams. I looked for yellow, just a line of it. The crowd was all coats and elbows. My mother's face when I found her. I do not speak of it. He paused. The tick of a clock Tess could not see kept time with a heart she could. They found her 2 hours later by the castle ramparts. A kind woman had stayed with her. She had an apple in her hand, half eaten, and the ribbon was gone. He breathed out, a thin thread of air. This was the first thing I ever found, truly found. Not the same ribbon, of course, but the same blue, lying in a shallow puddle near the west bow, a little bow that had lost its hair and kept its shape. He gestured toward the frame. I kept it, a reminder. Tess felt something unclasp inside her. She had learned to listen for risk, check alarms, count exits, calculate weight and consequence. She had not learned to listen like this. Her body responded before her training could intervene, shoulders softening, throat tight, eyes hot. "I am sorry," she whispered, and realized at once how small that was, how insufficient. Bernard looked at her properly now, the winter blue of his eyes clear and kind. "You were not there," he said. "You do not need to be sorry." No pity, only invitation. Tess reached for the tea to anchor her hands and found the cup warm and trembling against her fingers. From the corner of her eye she saw the neat looping labels that gave the room its quiet grammar. Single gloves, winter, leather, keys of unknown origin, buttons of significance, shattered things mended. Every word said, "I saw you, I named you, I kept you safe." "Bernard," she said, voice steadying, "my job is to keep you safe in here, to make sure you can move, cook, sleep without tripping, but I cannot ask you to throw away a life." The faintest smile touched his mouth. "Then we may yet be friends." He did not move from his chair. He simply reached with 2 careful fingers toward a small glass dome on the mantel and lifted it away to reveal a chipped ceramic thimble. It was ordinary and held like a jewel. "This one," he said, "sat on a windowsill on Rose Street. Rain on the glass, a woman inside the pub at the window, mending a sleeve beneath the electric glow. She finished the seam. The man laughed and kissed her fingers. She forgot the thimble when she hurried out into the rain. I like to think they married. I like to think the shirt lasted." Tess did not smile. She breathed, and the image went into her like light. She began to see how he did it. The evidence small, the tenderness vast. He did not invent. He remembered for people who would never remember for themselves. Her supervisor's voice flickered at the edge of her mind. Hazard, squalor, intervention, and fell quiet beneath the weight of the thimble story. She set the clipboard beside the chair, out of reach. "Will you tell me another?" she asked, surprising herself with the want in the question. "Not for the report, for me." Bernard regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. He turned his head slightly toward the frame with the ribbon and inclined it as if bowing to a small altar. "Elara wore that colour in spring," he said. "The rest of the year it was red or white, but spring was blue. She said blue was faster for running." A sound rose in his throat that might have been a laugh if it had not been so carefully held. "I have lived a long time since the market day. I have been a boy, a son, a clerk, a husband for 6 good years, a widower for many more, and always a finder. It is not nonsense, Miss Faraday. It is a kind of duty, a liturgy against forgetting." "A liturgy," Tess repeated quietly, the words settling like a shawl around her. Outside, a bus sighed at the curb. Someone laughed on the pavement. Rain ticked against the sash like shy fingers. Inside, the room felt contained and holy, a museum where nothing was behind glass because everything already had a guardian. "Do you see why I cannot simply clear?" he asked gently. "It is not that I love things. I do not. I love the proof that people passed through a moment, that they existed in a particular rain on a particular Tuesday, and that the world did not swallow that entirely." Tess nodded. The urge to reassure, to plan, to solve, the professional reflex eased. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself again. "Who kept you?" Bernard blinked once, twice, as if a speck of dust had landed in his eye. "I thought I was keeping myself," he said, almost to the ribbon rather than to her, "by keeping the world." "And is it working?" Tess asked softly. His breath caught. He looked so tired and so young all at once that she had to force her hands to stay in her lap. "Sometimes," he said, "often not." There was no tidy answer to give. She did not try. She sat and let the room speak. The labels, the glass domes, the stacks of magazines bridged by small paths he had made and remade 1,000 times. She thought of her own apartment and could not call to mind a single object that would miss her if she left. "I brought a checklist," she admitted, smiling without mirth. "It feels foolish now." "It is not foolish," he said at once. "It is your way of keeping your shelves and labels live in your head. Mine live on my walls. There is no shame in either." He lifted the thimble once more, turned it so that the chip caught the light, and set it down with a care that felt like prayer. Then he looked back at her with something like resolve brightening his eyes. "You may ask me your official questions," he said, a courtesy that felt like a treaty. "And then, if you wish, you may ask me about one thing on one shelf, and I will tell you the truth I have carried for it." Tess inhaled, exhaled, and nodded. She moved through the essentials: medication, cooking, washing, sleep, falls, fire alarms, each answer measured and plain. He managed more than she expected. He accepted help with what he did not. When she finished, the air seemed to relax. She turned to the wall of small frames. The blue ribbon was easiest to choose and impossible to touch. Her gaze drifted lower to a tiny pressed flower under glass, a forget-me-not, bleached to the colour of sky after years. "That one," she said, pointing. "Please." Bernard's smile was full and sorrowed. "Kelvingrove," he said. "A museum day long ago. A boy and a girl sat on the steps and shared a cheese sandwich. She tucked that flower into his coat as a joke and said, 'Now I am your museum.' He kept it for 2 days and lost it on the 3rd. He paused, then added, "He came back looking." "How do you know?" Tess asked. "I found his note," Bernard said, and from a small envelope he drew a scrap with pencil writing faint as breath. "If you find a tiny blue flower, it is ours. Please leave it on the 2nd step." Tess pressed a hand against her ribs, the ache there sweet and exact. "Did you leave it on the step?" she asked. "I did," Bernard said, "on a Tuesday with a stone to keep it from blowing away. I do not know if they returned again." The clock in the hall struck the hour, soft and domesticated, the sound of time behaving itself. Tess closed her eyes for a moment and let it pass through her. "Bernard," she said when the chime faded, "if I promise I will not allow anyone to come in here and ruin what you have made, if I promise I will help you make it safer without making it smaller, will you let me keep coming?" He looked at her as if measuring something not in inches or rules, but in trust. At last he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "on one condition." "What condition?" she asked, braced for a task. "You will choose one thing each visit, and you will let it choose you back. You will take it into your life for a week, and you will return with its story." Tess blinked, surprised into a laugh that felt young in her mouth. "You want me to borrow from the museum," she said. "I want you to practice keeping," he answered simply. "Not objects, the moments they point to." Her gaze slid over the shelves and came to rest on a glass jar of stubby pencils, some gnawed, some blunt, all shortened by use. They looked like effort, like children hunched over sums, like women making lists in kitchens where the light went early. "These," she said, "if you will allow it." He rose slowly, took the jar down and pressed it carefully into her hands. "They are yours for 7 days," he said. "Return with what you learned, not about the pencils, about yourself." His fingers were warm against the glass. Tess held the jar like a lantern. "Deal," she said, and the word felt like a small bridge set down between them. When she left, the evening had gathered over Leith Walk. the sky the colour of slate, the streetlights halos in the damp. The jar of pencils sat beside her on the bus like a companion. She thought of the ribbon, of a little hand in a larger hand, of a boy looking for yellow in a sea of coats, of a man who made a liturgy of keeping so that the world could not erase what it did not mean to lose. On her kitchen table she set the jar down and took one pencil in her fingers. It had been sharpened to a stubborn point, the wood uneven where a knife had done the work. She found scrap paper and wrote without thinking, a list that began as groceries and became a poem about holding on. She stopped, startled, and laughed and cried a little and let it stand. In the morning she would type a careful email to Linda about risk mitigation and voluntary engagement and a plan that would not use the word clearance. Tonight she touched the pencil to the page again and wrote the name at the top of a clean sheet, Elara, and below it, very small, a vow. I will not throw away what you kept. I will learn to keep too. The city outside exhaled. The room felt less empty. The jar of pencils watched from the centre of the table like a small, patient congregation. And Tess understood, for the first time in a long time, that compassion without weight was only air, and that she had been starving for years. She turned out the light, left one lamp glowing in the corner, and let the night hold her, the way a ribbon holds hair, simple and sure, so that something tender can face the wind and not be lost. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Pocket Watch. Wind rattled the windows on Leith Walk, a blustery Tuesday that pushed gulls inland and set the chimney pots to muttering. Tess shook rain from her coat at the door and stepped into Bernard's warmth, the familiar breath of old paper, lemon polish and tea rising to meet her like a welcome she dared not name. The jar of pencils sat in her tote, their short, stubborn bodies clinking softly when she moved. She had written with one the night before until the point went blunt, lists that became confessions, a poem she did not quite admit was a poem, and a vow that felt like a small thread tied to something she could not yet see. Bernard was waiting by the bay window, a small cloth in one hand and a tarnished pocket watch in the other. He polished the case with the absent devotion of long habit, the movement as steady as breath. The room around him was the same cathedral of small rescues, and yet something had shifted since the ribbon. Tess felt it before she could name it, as if a door had opened somewhere inside the house and let through air that had been waiting for years. "This one sits heavier than most," he said, without preamble, lifting the watch into the light. "I found it on Princes Street, a businessman's bench. You can tell by the posture, the briefcase held like a shield between the feet. The face knotted against the day before the day even begins." He turned the watch so the cracked glass caught the window's tired glow. The hands were frozen just past 11, a small, precise failure. "He checked it, I think," Bernard murmured. He pulled it from his waistcoat pocket to see whether the world still matched his plan, and perhaps the chain was weak, or perhaps his fingers were, I do not know. Time stopped for him in one way, and for the watch in another. Tess took it carefully when he offered it. It was colder than she expected, heavier, a weight that asked to be reckoned with. Not the glow of a phone screen, not the frictionless slide of numbers that update themselves, but time as a thing with gravity, with hinge and breath. The back plate was smooth under her thumb, the edge nicked by a life that did not look where it was going. "Do you think he came back for it?" she asked. Bernard's gaze drifted through the glass to the wet street beyond. "I waited," he said simply. "For hours. I have done that often enough to learn the weather by the stone. It was one of those Edinburgh mornings that cannot decide between rain and resolve. I held the watch in my hand and I watched the faces. People hurry when they have left a piece of themselves somewhere. They lean forward as if the body can arrive before the regret. I did not see him." "And after that," Tess said, the watch cooling her palm, "did you try to find the owner, posters, a note at the bench?" "In the beginning," he said, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth, "I stood beside the benches and the bus stops like a shepherd who has lost a lamb, holding up a single glove, a photograph, a key. People walk quickly around a person who is looking for something. It makes them anxious, as if loss were contagious." He shook his head softly. "I learned at last that my task was not return. My task was witness. I bring them here where time stops shouting and begins to speak, and I listen on their behalf. The line went through Tess like a smooth blade. Not cruel, just true. Witness. She looked down at the glass where the hairline crack ran like a healed wound and wondered how long the owner had carried that flaw against his pulse before the hinge gave out. "May I open it?" she asked. Bernard nodded. She pressed the catch and the case clicked with a satisfaction that felt almost indecent. Inside the dust rim was a faint inscription scratched by a hand that meant every letter. To A from C, keep good time. Someone had loved this urgency. Someone had sanctified it. Tess felt heat sting the backs of her eyes. She had lived by calendars and alarms, reminders that chimed until she obeyed, and none of it had weight. She closed the watch gently and laid it on her knee as if it might bruise. "It is a strange mercy," Bernard said, "to carry what others drop. You would think it would sink a man, but for me it has kept me from floating away." Tess sat back, the chair's upholstery sighing beneath her. "You asked me to borrow something," she said, the jar of pencils winking from the tote. "To let it choose me. I did. I wrote until the words surprised me. It felt like holding the handrail on a dark stair." Bernard's winter blue eyes warmed. "Good," he said. "Tools that have already done work are better at teaching us to work. They remember the shape of effort." He lifted the watch again, tilting it so the stopped hands looked like the shadow of a bird paused mid-flight. "I think he heard something at 11:05, he said, almost to himself. A piece of news, a decision, some telegram of the modern age, and the watch obeyed. It kept faith with the moment. It said, 'Here, remember here.'" Tess pictured the bench, the wind coming off Princes Street Gardens, a man with his jaw set hard enough to ache, his thumb finding the catch without looking, the slip, the small clatter that would be lost brakes and shoe leather and gulls. She found she was breathing carefully, as if not to disturb the imagined scene. "Do you mind if I try something?" she asked. "Just for me." Bernard gestured for her to go on. She drew out her phone, set a timer to 11 minutes and 5 seconds, and pressed start. The seconds bloomed quietly toward their end. "I want to sit with the exact weight of that time," she said, feeling foolish and not caring. "To know how long it takes to lose something without noticing." They waited. The room ticked. The kettle burred and hushed. A bus sighed. Someone laughed outside, and the sound folded into the wallpaper as if it had always lived there. When the timer chimed, both of them started, then smiled. Tess exhaled, shook her head, and whispered, "It is longer than it seems and shorter than I wanted." "Most of the important measurements are like that," Bernard said. She handed the watch back and he accepted it with the gravity of a sacristan. He did not replace it yet. He held it as if the warmth of his hand could persuade it to try again. "Bernard," Tess asked after a moment, "do you ever wish you had not begun? The keeping, the witness, that you had been someone else entirely?" He considered. The question did not bruise him. "After the grass market," he said, "I tried to become stone. Stones do not lose, and they do not break unless something greater insists. But I was not made of stone, so I made do with what I had. I kept. I remembered. I told myself stories that could bear the weight of the ones I could not tell out loud. If I had not begun, I do not know who I would be. But I do know I would be lonelier than I am." The honesty of it steadied her. She rested her hands on her knees, palms open, a posture she had learned in training for de-escalation and discovered, years later, could calm herself as well as others. "What else did you bring for me to see?" she asked, wanting another stitch before the seam cooled. He nodded toward a small tray near the mantel. On it lay a silver locket, its chain a tumble of knotted moonlight. A single, hand-knitted baby booty, pale green and impossibly small, a bus ticket softened by pocket sweat to the texture of cloth. Bernard lifted the locket first, pressed the catch, and showed her the empty oval where a face had once lived. "People think the loss is the jewellery," he said, "but the grief is the absence of the photograph, whatever prompted the thumb and forefinger to pinch and tug and remove the face that made the metal worth carrying. I found this on the steps by the Scott Monument. She sat there to decide, I think, the kind of sitting that changes a life." He set it down, took up the booty and cupped it as if warming a chick. "Bus seat," he murmured. "Near the back. I found it on a Tuesday. The wool still smelled faintly of laundry powder. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. The truth is not always written in the stitches. The bus ticket made the soft sound of a pressed leaf when he lifted it. He kept this long after he rode, Bernard said. Pocket relics do not last accidentally. He must have reached for it again and again to remind himself he was capable of moving from one place to another. Tess listened, the stories arriving without ornament, each an act of reverent imagination, not invention, a kind of archaeology of tenderness. She felt the knot of herself begin to loosen. "May I borrow something else?" she asked. "For the week. I will return it with a story, even if it is only the story of what it asked me to remember." Bernard considered the tray, then shook his head lightly and pointed not at the objects, but at the window. "Take a walk," he said, surprising her. "To Prince's Street. Sit where I found the watch. Listen to 11 minutes, 5 seconds. Then bring me back the sound. Sometimes the lost thing is not an object. Sometimes it is the habit of standing still long enough to hear a city keep itself." Tess smiled, felt it reach her eyes. "Deal," she said. They drank tea. They did not talk about Linda or forms or thresholds that trigger intervention. Those could wait. The rain eased to a glaze on the sash. When she rose to leave, the pocket watch lay again on the cloth like a sleeping animal. Bernard's hand hovered above it, then withdrew as if to prove he could. On the bus, she kept her phone in her pocket. She watched the city instead, the way people carried their faces, the small hunch of a young man reading a message he did not want, a woman with a cake box balanced on her knees, a child counting raindrops on the window. She realized that since she had met Bernard, she had begun to look for stories without reaching for solutions first. It felt disloyal to her training and faithful to something older. Prince's Street was slick and bright when she stepped off. The bench was unremarkable and exactly right. She sat, set the timer again, and let the city pour around her. At 6 minutes a gull scolded the sky. At 9 a cyclist laughed into his scarf. At 11 a bus driver tapped the wheel twice before pulling away. The chime arrived, soft on the phone, swallowed at once by the weather and the workday. She stood, a little steadier than she had arrived, and walked the length of the garden's railings with her hands in her coat pockets and her shoulders down. It was not much, and it was not nothing. That night the apartment felt different, not larger, just truer. She set the jar of pencils at the centre of the table as if asking them to bless the room. She opened her laptop to write a few lines in Bernard's case notes: voluntary engagement, harm reduction by curation, weekly visits, no clearance at this time. And closed it again. The language could catch up later. She took a pencil and wrote a letter she did not intend to post. "Dear Ilara, today we held a watch that forgot how to go on at 11:05. We did not try to fix it. We tried to understand what it was protecting. I sat on a bench and listened the way your brother listens. I think I am learning to keep." When she was done, she held the page a long time and then slid it beneath the jar like a placemat for grief. Before bed she searched carefully for Bernard Appleby. She had done this once already and found nothing. She did it again and found the same, the empty that is not proof of absence, just the world's poor filing. She closed the browser and sat in the quiet. The flat silence no longer sounded like emptiness, it sounded like room. The pencils waited like small, faithful things. The clock on her oven blinked blue, plastic time into the dark, and somewhere inside her the old, efficient engines fell quiet enough that she could hear the new, slower one begin, a thoughtful mechanism that ticked in sentences rather than alarms. She turned out the light and lay with her hand resting over the smooth river stone Bernard had given her at the door, a borrowed courage she had not expected. 11 minutes, 5 seconds, she thought. Enough to lose something, enough to begin finding it again. Chapter 4. The Proposition. Spring came grudgingly to Edinburgh. The light stretched a little longer each evening, but the wind still bit like an old habit refusing to die. From the tenement window, Tess could see the faint promise of green edging the rooftops of Leith Walk, a soft defiance against the grey. Inside Bernard's flat, though, the seasons never changed. It was a sealed world where time behaved differently, where the air still smelled of paper and polish, and where grief had been carefully archived. Her visits had settled into a rhythm that neither of them questioned. She arrived on Thursdays now, always with 2 takeaway scones and a jar of lemon curd that Bernard pretended he didn't like, but always finished. The clipboard was gone. It lived somewhere in her desk drawer, gathering its own layer of dust. Instead, she brought her notebook, a small, leather-bound one she'd started to fill with the stories of lost things in her own words. Bernard seemed lighter, not cured. She hated that word, but less brittle around the edges. His voice was stronger, his wit sharper, his shelves a little tidier in places. There was still a pathway only a narrow body could navigate, but it felt intentional now, curated rather than chaotic. Yet that morning, Tess sensed something different the moment she stepped inside. A nervous energy rippled through the room, like static before a storm. Bernard was at the table, but instead of polishing or labelling, he was turning a small, velvet-lined box over in his hands, opening and closing it again and again. He looked up as she set the scones down. "Miss Faraday," he said, using the formal address he'd mostly abandoned months ago. His voice trembled slightly. "I had a dream." Tess smiled gently, lowering herself into her usual chair. "About Ilara?" His nod was small, almost ashamed. She wasn't lost. She was waiting. There was something in his tone, not fear but conviction, that silenced any attempt she might have made to soothe him. "Dreams can feel real," she said softly. "This one was," he insisted. He placed the velvet box on the table between them, opening it with the reverence of a man unveiling a relic. Nestled inside was a small, worn teddy bear. One button eye was missing. The fur was faded to the colour of old honey. Its stitched smile had loosened on one side, giving it a wistful, almost human expression. "I call him Professor Bear," Bernard said. "He's been with me for 15 years. I found him near the university library, sitting on a bench like a forgotten friend. The leaves were falling, there was rain on the paving stones. He looked as if he'd been propped there on purpose, waiting for someone who never came." He brushed a finger along the bear's threadbare ear. "He wasn't discarded, you see. He was left behind. There's a difference. Someone loved him enough to carry him to adulthood, and then, in a moment's distraction, lost him." Tess leaned forward, the tenderness in his voice tugging something deep inside her. "He's sweet," she said quietly. Bernard looked up, his eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in him before. Determination. "I've been wrong all these years," he said. "I thought my purpose was to keep, to protect. But maybe that was only half of it. Maybe I was meant to return something, too." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the air between them. "You mean, find the person who lost him?" Tess asked, though she already knew the answer. Bernard nodded. "If I can return one thing, just one, then perhaps." He stopped himself, but the unfinished thought hung in the silence. "Then perhaps I'll have balanced the scales." It should have been absurd. The odds were impossible, the task ridiculous. A 15-year-old loss, a child turned adult, a city that swallowed memories whole. Tess's training rose up, ready to list every reason it couldn't work. Data protection, privacy laws, time elapsed, statistical probability, but none of it reached her mouth. Because she was looking at Bernard, the tremor in his hands. The way hope, raw and perilous, had returned to his face like blood to a body long cold. "Bernard," she began carefully, "I don't want you to be disappointed. After all these years, it has to be tried," he said simply. "If I fail, at least I'll have failed at something worth doing. For 60 years I've been holding the world still, afraid to move in case I broke it again, but perhaps movement is the only way to mend anything at all." Tess stared at him, her throat tight. He was offering her the same choice he'd offered her months ago when he first handed her the jar of pencils, to step outside the rules and into meaning. "All right," she said finally, exhaling as though the decision had been waiting in her lungs all along. "All right, Bernard. We'll try." He blinked, once then again as though he hadn't truly believed she would agree. Then his smile bloomed, slow and trembling and utterly transforming. "We'll need a plan," Tess said, finding comfort in the practical. "You said it was near the university library 15 years ago?" "Yes, late autumn. There was a protest that day, banners, students, music in the air. I remember because someone had dropped a leaflet on the bench beside him. I kept that too." He shuffled to a shelf and returned with a brittle piece of paper, folded neatly into quarters. It was an old student union flyer. Free the mind, end tuition fees, dated October 15 years earlier. Tess took it gently, as if afraid it might dissolve. That gives us a date, a location. We can work with that. Bernard sat down heavily, relief and wonder fighting for space in his expression. You'll help me find them? Yes, Tess said, but you'll have to let me do it properly. I'll need to post an appeal, online, on the university forums, alumni groups, maybe local community pages. We'll cast a net and see what comes back. Like messages in bottles, Bernard murmured, the corners of his mouth lifting. All we can do is hope someone finds one and writes back. Tess nodded. Exactly that. For a long time neither of them spoke. The tick of the clock filled the space between them, steady and patient. Bernard's gaze lingered on the bear, and Tess knew what he was thinking, that this wasn't about the toy at all. It was about Alara. About the little boy who had let go of his sister's hand for one terrible second and had been trying to make amends ever since. When she finally rose to leave, Bernard stopped her with a quiet word. "Miss Faraday," he said. "Thank you." She smiled faintly, one hand on the doorknob. "You can call me Tess, you know." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Tess." As she walked down the stairwell and out into the pale spring light, she realized she felt something she hadn't in years. Anticipation. Not for success or closure, but for the act of trying. Back at her flat, she opened her laptop and typed the first post carefully, line by line, making sure each word carried the right tone. Not sentimental, not desperate, just quietly hopeful. Long shot, looking for anyone who may have lost a small brown teddy bear, one button eye missing, near the University of Edinburgh main library around October, approximately 15 years ago. He's been safe all this time and would love to find his way home. She hit post and sat back, watching the cursor blink in the stillness of her apartment. For the first time since she could remember, the emptiness of the room didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like waiting. Chapter 5. The Quest for Professor Bear. It began not with fanfare, but with the soft hum of Tess's laptop and the rustle of Bernard's archive boxes. The air in his flat seemed to vibrate with purpose, as though every object, every glove, button and photograph had paused to listen. Tess had become a fixture there, her coat hung neatly on the hook by the door, her mug waiting beside Bernard's chipped china one. The scones had become ritual now, one fruit, one plain, as if the universe demanded symmetry for what they were attempting. She had taken over a corner of his dining table, her laptop glowing like some small modern altar amid his collection of the past. On the screen, her message had already begun to ripple through digital space. Alumni forums, university pages, community groups, the modern equivalent of tying a note to a pigeon and hoping it found its way home. The post was simple, but it carried the quiet gravity of longing. 15 years ago, a small brown teddy bear, one eye missing, was lost near the University of Edinburgh main library. He's been lovingly kept safe ever since, and we'd dearly love to return him to his rightful owner. Tess refreshed the page every few minutes, knowing it was pointless. Hope was never a creature of efficiency. Bernard, meanwhile, was busy in the only way he knew, by arranging meaning. He worked through his shelves like a curator preparing for an exhibition. If we are to send a bear back into the world, he said, we must do so properly. He had lined up a small selection of items he thought might help. The faded flyer from the student protest, a map of the campus yellowed with age, and a photograph he'd taken of the bear shortly after he found him, perched upright, slightly forlorn, but dignified. Tess smiled as she watched him move, careful and methodical. You're treating this like an expedition. It is, he said, without looking up. Only instead of searching for treasure, we're returning it. The warmth in his tone made her chest tighten. He had begun to change, subtly, but unmistakably. The stooped posture had lifted a little, the old cardigan had been mended, and when he spoke of Alara now, there was less ache in his voice. The guilt had not vanished, but it had softened into something that resembled peace. Tess typed and searched and scrolled, her face lit by the faint blue light of the screen. Hours slipped away unnoticed. Occasionally she would read aloud a comment. Someone thinks they might remember a lost toy around that time, or there's a postgrad who's checking with an old roommate. Bernard would nod solemnly, as if each possibility were a small candle lit against the dark. When the replies slowed to silence, Tess shut the laptop with a sigh. Now we wait. Bernard gave a small, knowing smile. Waiting is an art, he said, and like all art, it needs practice. He poured tea, and they sat together in companionable quiet. Around them, the cluttered room seemed alive with expectation. The clock ticked, the kettle burbled softly on its cooling plate, and the faint hum of the city outside reminded Tess that the world, despite everything, kept moving. But Bernard wasn't content to wait passively. Over the next few days, he began sharing the stories behind other small relics, as if to remind himself that not every search ended in loss. He showed Tess a locket he'd found on the steps of the Scott Monument, silver, the clasp slightly bent, the oval inside empty. This wasn't just jewellery, he said, pressing it open with a trembling thumb. It was a frame for a face that someone couldn't bear to look at anymore. When the photograph goes missing, people think the loss is the locket. But it isn't. It's the memory that was once safe inside. Tess touched the metal, cold and smooth, and thought of her own life, the faces she'd chosen to stop keeping framed. Next came a tiny knitted bootie, pale green, soft as breath. Bernard cupped it gently. This was found on a bus seat. Perhaps it was a moment's distraction, a mother too tired to notice, or perhaps it was the last thing she had to hold. The simplicity of it pierced Tess in a way she hadn't expected. There were no grand tragedies in these stories, just small absences that cut quietly. Each object was a doorway into a world of emotion, and Bernard moved through them like a man walking through memories rather than rooms. For every lost glove or broken toy, he had a theory, a tenderness. It was his language, his way of forgiving the world for being careless. By the end of the week, Tess began to realize how much he had changed her. She caught herself noticing things. A dropped mitten on a park bench, a shopping list left in a trolley, a half-finished crossword abandoned on a cafe table. She found herself wondering who had left them behind, what story they had belonged to. She was starting to see the world the way Bernard did, not as a catalogue of losses, but as a map of moments worth keeping. Then one evening as rain streaked the window and the kettle began its familiar rattle, her phone buzzed. A private message. She blinked at the screen, heart thudding. "This is probably a long shot," the message read, "but my old roommate, Eleanor Vance, lost a bear exactly like the one you described during our final year. She was devastated. She's Dr. Eleanor Vance now, a historian at St. Andrews. I can put you in touch if you'd like." Tess froze. The world seemed to narrow to the small pool of light around the message. "Bernard," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We might have found her." He looked up sharply from his chair, his teacup hovering halfway to his lips. "Found who?" "The owner," Tess said, "of Professor Bear." For a heartbeat he didn't move. Then his hands began to shake. The cup rattled against its saucer. "You're certain?" "No," Tess said honestly, her own voice shaking now. "But it's a Lade, a real one." Bernard set the cup down carefully, his fingers trembling. He pressed both palms flat against the table, grounding himself, then looked at her with a fragile, luminous hope that made her chest ache. "Tell me her name again," he said softly. "Dr. Eleanor Vance." He smiled faintly. "A scholar, fitting company for a professor." Tess let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "I'll write to her tonight." They sat for a long moment in silence, letting the truth of it settle. After months of stillness, the world had shifted under their feet, a tiny miraculous tilt. Bernard's gaze fell to the small bear resting on the table between them. "You see, Miss Faraday," he murmured, his voice shaking with emotion. "He wants to go home." And Tess, who had built her life around keeping the world at arm's length, found herself blinking back tears for a small, one-eyed bear who might, against all odds, finally find his way back to where he belonged. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, the rain easing to a mist. Somewhere beyond the glass, beyond the hum of buses and footsteps and traffic lights, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance lived her life unaware that her long-lost bear was being prepared for the journey home. Tess reached across the table, resting her hand briefly over Bernard's. "We'll find her," she said softly. "We will." And for the first time in years, she didn't doubt herself when she said it. Chapter 6. The woman at the library. For a week, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tess had exchanged several polite, carefully written emails with Dr. Eleanor Vance, historian lecturer and the possible owner of Professor Bear. The tone of her replies was measured but kind. She had been deeply moved by the story, and though she admitted she couldn't be certain the bear was hers, she remembered losing one that fit the description. When she suggested meeting in person, Tess hesitated only long enough to ask Bernard if he felt ready. His answer had been a trembling but resolute yes. "We owe it to him," he said, resting a hand on the little bear's worn fur. "He's waited long enough." And so one pale afternoon in early April, Tess helped Bernard into her car. He was dressed in his best, a tweed jacket brushed clean, a wool scarf tucked neatly at his collar, shoes polished to a soft shine. He looked both dignified and heartbreakingly fragile, his thin hands clutching the small cotton bag that held Professor Bear as though it were a relic. The drive to the University of Edinburgh was quiet but companionable. Tess found herself hyper-aware of every sound: the slow sweep of the wipers, the click of Bernard's seatbelt buckle, the rhythm of his shallow breathing. She wondered what memories the city must stir in him. The same streets he'd walked decades earlier, when Alara's laughter still echoed somewhere in the world. When they reached George Square, the wind caught at their coats as they stepped out. The university library loomed ahead, all glass and symmetry, a monument to modern intellect. To Tess it always felt sterile, but today, with Bernard beside her, the place seemed sacred. Inside, the hush of academia wrapped around them. The faint scent of paper, coffee, and rain-soaked coats clung to the air. Students passed with earbuds in and eyes down, unaware that history, not theirs but something older, heavier, was unfolding just beyond their notice. They found a bench in the grand entrance hall. Tess guided Bernard to sit, and he placed the cotton bag on his knees, resting one trembling hand over it. "It feels strange," he murmured, "to be waiting for someone you've never met, and yet who has been in your thoughts for so long." "She'll be here soon," Tess said, though she was trying to convince herself as much as him. Then she saw her, a woman walking toward them through the crowd. Dr. Eleanor Vance looked every bit the academic, composed, graceful, her hair pinned neatly back, her coat a soft grey that matched the marble beneath her feet. She was perhaps in her late 30s, but there was a warmth in her expression that softened the austerity of her posture. "Mr. Appleby? Miss Faraday?" she asked, extending a gloved hand with a polite smile. Bernard stood, straightening as though facing something holy. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice low but steady, "thank you for coming." "Please," she said gently. "Eleanor." Tess introduced them briefly, explaining how Bernard had found the bear, how long he'd kept it safe. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes softening. "And you think this might be the one I lost?" she asked quietly. Bernard nodded and with trembling fingers opened the cotton bag. He drew out the small bear and held it toward her like an offering. The library's light, pale and diffuse, fell across the little toy's worn fur, glinting off the single remaining button eye. Eleanor took it in her hands, cradling it delicately, as though it might crumble. "Oh," she breathed, "he does look familiar." She turned the bear over, her fingers brushing gently across the stitches. "The missing eye, the little patch here." Her voice trailed off into a sigh. "I lost mine during my final exams. I must have been 21. I remember setting him down on the bench outside while I sorted my notes, and then he was gone." Tess's chest tightened. Bernard's entire body seemed suspended between hope and heartbreak. Eleanor smiled. Not the polite, professional smile from before, but something softer, sadder. "You've taken such care of him," she said. "It's extraordinary, what you've done." Bernard's hands, which had been clasped tightly in front of him, relaxed. "So it is him?" he asked, his voice a fragile whisper. Eleanor hesitated. Her smile faltered. She looked again at the bear, at its small face, its crooked seams, and shook her head gently. "I'm so sorry," she said. "He's almost identical. But mine was called Barnaby, and he wore a little felt waistcoat my grandmother made. This isn't him." The words struck the air like the toll of a bell. Tess felt the weight of them before she saw the effect on Bernard. His eyes clouded. His shoulders sagged. For a long, silent moment he stood frozen, his hand hovering uselessly between them. Then he nodded, once, twice, as though trying to agree with the pain. "I see," he said softly. Of course, of course. Eleanor's expression was full of compassion. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but I do want to thank you truly for the kindness you've shown. What you've done keeping him, caring for him. It's remarkable. It really is. Bernard managed a small, hollow smile. You're very kind. She handed the bear back gently, placing him in Bernard's open palms. He's lovely, she said quietly. Whoever he belonged to, they would be grateful to know he found someone like you. Bernard nodded again, his lips pressed tight. Thank you, Dr. Vance. And that was all. He turned and shuffled toward the great library doors, each step slow and deliberate. Tess murmured a quick goodbye to Eleanor and hurried after him, her heart twisting. The automatic doors opened, spilling them back into the cold, grey afternoon. They walked to the car in silence. Bernard's scarf had come loose, but he didn't seem to notice. He clutched the cotton bag to his chest, his fingers gripping the fabric as if the bear might escape. In the car, he didn't speak. His eyes stayed fixed on the window, though Tess doubted he was seeing anything outside it. She drove slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile calm he was holding on to. When they reached Leith Walk, he climbed the stairs without help, but his movements were mechanical, drained of energy. Inside the flat, he placed the cotton bag on the table and sank into his armchair. The ticking of the clocks filled the silence between them, an orchestra of patient, indifferent time. Bernard, Tess said quietly, kneeling beside his chair. You did something wonderful. You tried. He shook his head, the motion barely perceptible. Some things, he murmured, once lost are meant to stay that way. I should have known better. That's not true, she said, but her voice felt small. He turned his gaze to the little bear sitting on the table. He was never hers, he said. He was never mine. He's just another reminder. Tess wanted to argue, to tell him that trying mattered more than success, but the words wouldn't come. Because she could see it, the heartbreak, the years of guilt collapsing in on themselves, the delicate scaffolding of hope giving way beneath him. Thank you for everything, Miss Faraday, he said quietly, but I think you've done all you can for me now. It was a dismissal, spoken with the finality of a closing door. Tess's throat ached. Bernard, please, he said, his voice almost breaking. Just go. She hesitated, then nodded, though her heart rebelled against every step toward the door. All right, she whispered, but I'll be back. He didn't reply. As she stepped into the stairwell, Tess heard the soft chime of a clock somewhere deep in the flat, a small, faithful heartbeat in a house that felt suddenly unbearably still. Outside, the city was beginning to darken. The streetlights blinked on one by one, casting their long reflections in the wet pavement. Tess walked to her car, her own reflection fractured in every puddle she passed. Behind her, in the flat above Leith Walk, Bernard sat unmoving in his chair, his eyes fixed on the table. The little bear stared back at him, its single-button eye glinting in the lamplight, silent, patient, waiting. Chapter 7. The Unravelling. For 3 days Bernard's flat remained silent. Tess called twice, knocked once, and waited outside his door until the cold crept through her coat, but there was no answer. The faint hum of ticking clocks that usually slipped through the cracks in the door was absent, replaced by an emptiness that chilled her far more than the Edinburgh wind. At work, her supervisor, Linda, noticed the change. "He stopped responding?" she asked. Her voice clipped, her pen already scratching notes on a pad. Tess nodded. "Since our last visit, it was difficult for him." Linda sighed, exasperated rather than unkind. "Tess, you've done everything you can. He's an elderly man living alone, surrounded by what is, let's be honest, a health hazard. We can't have another case collapse into self-neglect. Fill out the welfare risk forms. We'll arrange an assessment." Tess's pulse spiked. The assessment was code for something cold, bureaucratic, a removal order if he didn't cooperate. His home, his collection, his life, all of it reduced to a hazard report. "He's grieving, not incapable," she said, trying to keep her tone even. Linda's expression softened slightly, but stayed firm. "You're too close, Tess. You can't save everyone. Compassion has its limits." The words stung because they carried a truth Tess didn't want to face. She was too close. Somewhere between the thimble and the bear, she'd stopped being his social worker and started being something else, something fragile, undefinable. She spent that night pacing her flat, staring at the tidy lines of her furniture, the blank walls, the silence that now seemed hostile. Bernard's voice came back to her. It's a lighter burden than carrying nothing at all. She pressed her hands to her face, and for the first time in years she let herself cry. Not for him, not entirely, but for everything she had held at arm's length, the missed calls to her mother, the friendships she'd let drift, the quiet ache of a life that looked orderly but felt empty. When she woke, her resolve had hardened. She wasn't going to let him fade. Not like this. By the time she reached Leith Walk, the sky was a muted wash of grey. She stood before his door, her knuckles trembling slightly before she knocked. "Bernard, it's Tess," she called. "I'm not leaving." There was no reply. She waited, then knocked again, louder this time. "I know you can hear me." Still silence. Then at last, the sound of shuffling feet, a lock turning. The door opened a few inches, revealing a sliver of Bernard's face, pale, hollow-eyed, defeated. "I have nothing more to say," he murmured. "Well, I do," Tess said softly, pushing the door open wider. She stepped inside without waiting for permission. The air hit her, stale, heavy with neglect. The room was darker than she'd ever seen it. Curtains drawn, dust beginning to reclaim surfaces he'd once polished daily. Professor Bear sat on the small table beside the armchair, untouched. "Bernard," she said, her voice trembling with anger she didn't fully understand, "you told me once that you collect these things because they matter, because the world forgets too easily. But what about you? You've spent your life remembering everyone else's losses. Who remembers yours?" He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the small cotton bag folded neatly beside the bear. "I was foolish," he said quietly, "to think I could put something right. I can't fix what was broken. I never could." Tess moved closer, kneeling in front of him. "Wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "You've fixed more than you know." He blinked, but she pressed on, the words spilling out now, fierce and unstoppable. "This room isn't full of rubbish, Bernard. It's full of proof. Proof that you saw people. That you noticed the smallest, quietest heartbreaks and gave them a home. That you've spent 60 years mending the world one forgotten glove at a time. You didn't fail Alara. You honoured her. You've spent your entire life making sure no one else was left behind." His lips trembled. "But I didn't save her," he whispered. Tess's eyes filled. "No, you didn't, and that's the grief that made you human. But you saved so many pieces of what came after, these small things, these lives you never even met, and you saved me, Bernard." He finally looked at her then, his eyes cloudy with disbelief. "I was lost," Tess said, her voice trembling. "I thought caring was just a job. I thought keeping my life empty would keep me safe. And then I met you. You taught me that the things we carry, the ones that hurt, the ones that weigh us down, they're what make us real." Silence filled the flat, thick and trembling. A clock chimed somewhere in the background, soft, uncertain, but there. Bernard's lips parted, but no words came. Only a sound, a single, quiet sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. His shoulders shook once, and then again, and finally he let go. Tess reached out and took his hand. It was cold, fragile, the skin paper-thin. He gripped hers tightly, as though afraid she might disappear like everything else he'd lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so very sorry." She shook her head, tears running freely down her cheeks. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You've spent your whole life saying sorry to the past. Maybe it's time to say thank you to the present." They sat that way for a long time, the social worker and the keeper, the lost and the found, their hands clasped between towers of mended things. When Bernard finally spoke again, his voice was different, weaker but lighter. "You're quite right, Miss Faraday," he said, a flicker of his old humour returning. "It seems I've been hoarding grief." Tess smiled through her tears. "Then maybe it's time to let a little go." He nodded, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Perhaps, but not all of it. Some of it belongs here." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, some of it does." The clocks continued their gentle chorus, 1,000 tiny heartbeats of brass and gear ticking in quiet agreement. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and cleansing, tapping against the windows like a rhythm Bernard had been waiting his whole life to hear. In that small flat above Leith Walk, something fragile but unmistakable shifted. Not joy, not yet, but peace. A slow, careful mending, beginning from within. The keeper of lost things had finally allowed himself to be found. Chapter 8. The Last Lost Thing. Spring unfurled slowly over Edinburgh in fits and pauses. The air still carried a bite in the mornings, but the sunlight that spilled over the rooftops on Leith Walk had begun to linger a little longer each day. Inside Bernard's flat, time had softened. The place no longer felt like a mausoleum of memory. It breathed again. The change wasn't sudden. It was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. A curtain drawn open. The faint scent of lemon polish, not out of habit this time, but out of care. Light pooled on surfaces long hidden in shadow, glinting off glass, chrome and brass. Tess noticed it on her next visit, the subtle rearranging of the world. Bernard greeted her at the door, slower than before, but with colour in his cheeks. "You see," he said, gesturing her inside, "I've made some space." He wasn't wrong. The towers of boxes had thinned, reshaped into neat lines. The shelves were still full, of course, but they no longer loomed. Each one now seemed deliberate, intentional, as though the room itself had decided to breathe again. Tess set her coat on the back of a chair and smiled. "It's beautiful, Bernard. You've curated it." He chuckled softly. "Not cleared, mind you. I told you I don't believe in erasure, just reordering, giving each thing its proper rest." And that's what it was, not a purge, but a reckoning. Each object had been given its story, its piece. The single gloves, winter leather, had been paired up into one great box, together at last, if only symbolically. The keys of unknown origin rested inside a small polished chest, a plaque reading, "To all the doors once locked and those never opened." Even Professor Bear had found his place, seated proudly on the mantelpiece beside the porcelain rabbit from the shelf of shattered things mended. His missing eye had not been replaced. Bernard had insisted it stay that way. Some absences, he'd said, are worth remembering. They worked together through the days that followed, Tess helping him label, dust, rearrange, while Bernard told stories she'd never heard before. But now his stories had changed. They were not confessions of sorrow, but small tributes. Celebrations of humanity in all its clumsy, fleeting beauty. "Here," he said one afternoon, holding up a tiny glass bottle. A single dried petal inside, found on the steps of the hospital when my wife passed. I kept it, thinking it was hers. It wasn't, but grief makes you gather what you can. He placed it on the shelf labelled "Love Endured." Tess's throat tightened. Every label, every placement was a chapter in a life, and she realised what they were building together wasn't just a home. It was an archive of tenderness. On a bright Sunday morning, while sorting through a stack of small boxes tucked behind a wardrobe, Tess found one marked simply "The Beginning." The handwriting was faint, trembling with age. She carried it to Bernard, who sat by the window with a blanket over his knees. He looked at the box for a long time before opening it. Inside were small, ordinary things: a marble, a feather, a ticket stub, and at the bottom a smooth grey river stone. "This," he said quietly, rolling the stone between his fingers, "was the second thing I ever kept. I found it the day they found Ilara. I was walking home from the police station, and there it was, in a puddle, half buried. I picked it up because it felt solid, a thing that couldn't be broken or lost." He held it out to her. "I want you to have it." Tess froze. "Bernard, I can't." "You can," he said softly, "because it's part of the same story now. You came to help me find order, but what you really did was bring me peace. So keep it, Tess, so you never feel lost, so you remember that even the smoothest stone was shaped by storms." She took it in both hands, the cool weight grounding her. It was no bigger than a plum, its surface perfectly worn, but the weight of it was immense, the weight of a lifetime. Her eyes stung. "Thank you," she whispered, but he shook his head. "No, thank you." They didn't speak for a while after that. Words would have been too small. The clock ticked gently in the corner, and the sunlight moved slowly across the floorboards. Patient, tender, unhurried. Weeks passed. The flat transformed completely. The clutter became a museum, a testament, a memory made whole. Tess's supervisor had finally closed the case with a bemused shrug, telling her, "Whatever you've done, keep doing it." Even the neighbours, once impatient and unkind, began to greet Bernard when they passed, a nod, a smile, an understanding that he was not a hoarder of rubbish, but a keeper of the things everyone else forgot. Tess visited often. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they just talked. Sometimes they sat in silence, both of them content in the gentle rhythm of restored time. Then one afternoon, as light poured through the bay window and the dust danced like snowflakes in the air, Bernard turned to her. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think being the keeper of lost things was my punishment." Tess looked up from the tea tray. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think it was my calling. Perhaps some of us are meant to notice what others lose, to hold the small, forgotten things until someone else remembers to care again." Her throat caught. "That sounds like you, Bernard." "No," he said gently, "that sounds like you." That night, when she returned home to her tidy flat, Tess set the grey stone on her bedside table. For the first time, the emptiness didn't feel hollow. It felt calm, expectant even. She sat beside it, holding a notebook on her lap, and began to write down the stories Bernard had told her. Not as reports, not as evidence, but as a way of keeping them safe. She called it the Keeper's Catalogue, and each night after she added another. Months later, she stood once more in the flat on Leith Walk. Bernard sat in his armchair by the window, a blanket drawn over his knees, the faintest smile on his face as he watched the sunlight shift over the rows of clocks. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. "It is," Tess said, her voice soft. "It really is," he nodded faintly. "I'm glad I got to see it finished." That evening, as the clock struck 7, Bernard closed his eyes. He did not stir again. When Tess found him, he was peaceful, the faintest smile still on his lips. His hand rested gently on Professor Bear, his fingers curled loosely around the little creature's paw. The coroner called it heart failure, but Tess knew better. Time had simply stopped for him, as it must for all keepers eventually. She sat in the quiet, surrounded by the rhythm of clocks, all ticking slightly out of sync, yet somehow harmonious. It felt like he was still there, in the sound. And on the mantelpiece, Professor Bear remained beside the porcelain rabbit. Sometimes when the light was right and the wind carried faint echoes of the city through the open window, she swore she could hear Bernard's voice again, steady, kind, a little wistful. "You see, Miss Faraday." It would seem to say, the point was never to find what's lost, it's to remember that we looked. Tess smiled every time she heard it, because that, she realized, was the truest thing he'd ever taught her, that what we find along the way, the people, the moments, the quiet acts of care, are never really lost. They just wait to be seen again. And so, under the steady ticking of 100 clocks, the keeper of lost things lived on, not in grief, but in grace.
This was The Keeper of Lost Things, written by Bernard Coops.
If this story found a place in your heart, take a moment to sit with it, to remember the things you've lost and the ones you've found along the way. Because sometimes what stays with us isn't what we hold, but what we learn to let go of. Bernard Appleby's world may have been full of forgotten things, but in his kindness, in his patience, he found what truly mattered: connection, forgiveness, and peace. And maybe, in listening, you found a piece of that too. If you enjoyed this story, please ring the bell, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel for more full-length audiobooks, all free to listen, all told from the heart. Thank you for listening, and remember, not everything that's lost is gone forever.